So, chapter 1, the problem. The first thing we look at, the first thing you need to identify is what is the problem you want to solve? What is the target of your intervention? So, let's first have a look at what the marking guidelines say about the problem and how to achieve a high grade there. So, in order to get a first, you need to have a problem that is clearly identified and described. Evidence is given that a problem exists, and evidence is given that a problem is important. That the problem is something we should address on. Wording is clear and concise, references are given. So here are certain things that I will explain in more detail in a second using the examples of previous work by students, but let me just kind of highlight 2 or 3 things here. First, a problem is clearly identified and described. So it's something that is, I often tell you, be a sniper and not be kind of like look at something globally. So for instance, don't say, or don't have a problem that has something along the lines, social media is a problem for society, or screen time is a problem for children, or something really big and vague where you can't really find any precise numbers. So if you can't find any numbers that relate to that specific problem, I think fake news is another good example where people often come like, oh, fake news is a problem for our society. It's the end of the world. And then it's like, where in which particular area do you think fake news is a problem? And then it's like politics. And then it's like, what kind of politics? And then so forth. And then they realize, it's actually pretty difficult to find a specific problem that is related to fake news. So what I want you to do is start with something general, if you have something general, and then go more and more and more specific. Okay. And then one first step is that you can actually give evidence that the problem exists. So if you don't find numbers, it might just be that your problem is too vague, right? It might be unclear which population you have in mind when you're talking about a problem, who is suffering. And so there is your first indicator that maybe you didn't pick the right problem yet. And then there's something that often is forgotten is like to show that the problem is important. I often kind of snarkily say like, well, imagine you have a study that shows that there is 80% of frozen spinach that is purchased is not used before the expiring date. That might be true. You can say like, look, there's a problem that exists. Shouldn't I kind of design a behavior intervention tool to change that problem? And I said like, but why is this important? Why should we care about this? Why should we put our money into this problem and not into something else? So I think it's often we feel like, oh, it's obvious that that this is a problem, but you please spell out why this is important. And you will see that how to do that in the examples I will give next. So let's start with the first example. And this is from an intervention that tries to help young people that have mental health problems to actually go out and seek mental health care. Okay. So the first one is young people have mental health problems, and if they do so, don't they get the treatment that they need? And here, this is what the group found. They said, yes, 20% of adolescents experience mental health problems in a year, and so they have it, and 70% of children and adolescents who experience mental health problems do not get the appropriate interventions. So there seems to be a disconnect with, yes, a lot of mental health problems occur the first time in childhood and adolescence, but the adolescents often do not get the care that they need. Okay, so there is a problem. It's obvious that we need to kind of treat people who have mental health issues, but it seems like that they don't get it. My advice, my feedback here to that group verse and to my feedback to their manual was like, is this a psychological problem? Can you show that this is not a structural problem? Can you show that this is not a policy problem? You could imagine that there's a situation in the UK where the teenagers are eager to seek interventions. They want intervention. They go to the GP. They go to mental health specialists, but they don't have the resources or the money to help them in any capacity. So in order to change that these teenagers would get adequate treatment, it would not be something we have to do with the teenager, but we would have to convince politicians to spend more money on that. And I'm not sure if this is a psychological problem. It could be, but it would be very different. So make sure that you spell out also what's the psychological contribution to the problem, right? Here's a second intervention, an evidence-based intervention for increasing employment of Black people within the London Metropolitan. Okay. So I remember when I was working with the group, the first thing I said, like, okay, they said like, oh, we want like black people are underrepresented within the British police force, and I said like, well, there's certain areas in Great Britain where there basically no black people live there. Is that still a problem? Do you want to increase the representation there as well? And there's like, maybe we should look into something more specific. They made it more specific, and they looked in London. And here you can see, if you look at the numbers, and this is something I took out of their manual, this stat is like, can see, I almost crossed it out, that of the proportion of police officers in the London Met is 3.5 who are black. So among 100, there are about 3 to 4 black people among 100 police officers. But then if you look at the population, it's about 15%, so 15 out of 100. Very stark difference, right? And then I said to them, okay, but why is this a problem? Is this really a problem? Do you have any evidence that this is something that affects the police force negatively and the job they're meant to do? And yes, then they go on and show like, okay, there is institutional racism within the London Met. Even the London Met admits that. And there seems to be a particular problem with how the police treats young black men in London, and then vice versa. Young black men seem to have a really negative attitude towards the London police force, and the trust within the black community in London towards the police force is super low, much lower than the trust other communities have towards the police force. So there's a real problem there. And this is, I think I said it in the beginning, it's important to spell out why something is truly a problem. And here it's evident it's a real problem because they spelled it out. But you might feel like it's enough to say like, oh, we don't have enough black people on the police force. That might be true, but please spell out why this could affect the work of the police force negatively and why this is a problem that we should address, okay? Don't stop by something and feel like, oh, that's self-evident, that's a problem. So this was very well done. Here my feedback was careful to spell out why something is a problem. The third intervention was an evidence-based intervention to resolve debt. So it's very easy to find a lot of numbers of why people in the UK have trouble with debt. So this is how they started. Then it's like, okay, what kind of debt do you want to target? And it's like, okay, we're trying to look at credit card debt, so they get more specific. This is financially very harmful. Then, and I think this is really nice here, they also spelled out many additional kind of factors in their manual, as you can see on the on Moodle, of the negative effect of that on health, mental health, stress, well-being, relationship, happiness, and so forth. So it's not just something financial, which would be bad enough, but it's also something that is impacting many, many lives across the UK, a real serious problem that we as people who live in Britain have trouble saving money. And so this is really good. One thing I kind of said, and you can see it a little bit in the manual more, they have a lot of kind of like in the beginning when they start, they have a lot of sources that are Guardian, Financial Times, and so forth, popular press articles. And these popular press articles often write up government reports or empirical evidence gathered in peer-reviewed studies. But I want you to cite the latter and not the former. I want you to look at the report themselves and cite those and not read just the write-up. It's always good to start like reading a write-up, but then actually cite the real sources and not a source that reports on another source. Okay? So what's your sources was my feedback there. I think I get often questions about problems or problems presented, and I say, why do you think is a problem? And then the student would send me a blog post or a tweet or something from an article that is not peer-reviewed or anything like that. Okay, so make sure that you have the correct sources when you cite your problem. The bigger picture. You might wonder, like, why is this so important? I think for me, I have a real passion for trying to kind of open your eyes for understanding how to see what is important in our lives using data. Because I think at the end of the day, not only when you do your bachelor, but when in psychology, but when you do in a bachelor in general, I want you to become mature citizens who have a sophisticated and well-educated understanding of what is going on in our society, what are the problems that are ailing our society, and what is important and how can we address that. And I think often when we look at the problems of society, we are kind of misguided by press articles, by certain narratives that we have, and we have very little evidence that things are actually a problem that we think of a problem. So I think knife crime is a real good example. We want to believe that there's a real problem of knife crime in the UK and London in particular. We do, in quotation marks, a lot of things to kind of stop that. This is an article from The Guardian. I think it's in 2019. Knife crime hits record high in England and Wales. So this is a report on a government report. Okay, so it's important. I said that before. And what's your sources? Excuse me. So because here, this is knife crime hits record high in England and Wales, but then you read it and it's like, okay, in the 12 months to June, there were 235 knife murders and 412 attempted murders, while the total number of homicides recorded by the police fell by 5%. It also seems that homicides committed by a knife or sharp instrument, another red flag, a kind of wishy-washy definition of something, fell by 14%. So if it was less likely in the year to get murdered by a knife, somehow still the numbers rose. And I think this is like something where you can see that we want to believe, and many people who live in London want to believe, that knife crime is on the rise and it's a real problem. But then if you read the article, you can see that there's a decrease, especially in London. So knife crime is actually falling in London, according to this report. You can still say that any knife crime is too much, and that's fine. All I'm saying is, okay, before we kind of dive into that and say, like, okay, of the limited amount of money we have to spend on problems in our society, is knife crime really one? Or is this something that politicians like to go on about because it fits in a certain stereotype about the people that live in London? I think terrorism is the equivalent here. Is terrorism really a problem? Is the kind of, if we look at the stats, if we look at the frequency, if we look at the likelihood that you can die of by any act of terrorism compared to any other, like driving a car or climbing on a ladder. And I think we have to critically ask ourselves, okay, is this something we should spend our money on? Another one is, like, as a parent, I have two children, is screen time. Screen time is a big discussion, always like, okay, should they have more or less? How can we manage it? Here's like an article again from The Guardian, where it's like, screen time is as addictive as junk food. How do we children wean off? So this seems like, oh yes, this is a real problem within our society. We should have a social psychological intervention to change how they use their screens. So then a lot of, like, to this narratives, a lot of scientists wrote in to The Guardian and to other publications saying, look, guys, there's no real evidence that screen time is a real problem, right? The BBC kind of summarized it nicely in saying, okay, very less about children's screen time use, parents told. So the official recommendations and guidelines said there's no evidence that screen time per se is bad, and you shouldn't really worry about this as a parent. So then The Guardian responds to that and says, like, wow, is it damaging? Oh, wow, scientific studies can't tell us that. So there's still the narrative that prevails despite the lack of evidence, or evidence showing the opposite, right? So often our understanding of what ails our children, our society, and us in general is kind of driven by narratives that often are very misleading, have very little evidence. I think, and I want to leave you with that, Hans Rosling is kind of the guy who really inspired me to kind of talk a little bit more about that, and showing that if you consume a lot of media, you think that the world is getting worse and worse and worse. But if you look at the data, if you look at the numbers, the world is getting better and better and better. You and I live in a world that has never been, like, compared to any other historic time, has never been better. And we are amazingly well off. Yet if we consume the media, if we consume Twitter, social media, Facebook, etc., we think like, oh my God, the world is about to collapse. So here's wonderful TED Talks, a wonderful book on this. I encourage you to seek it out, especially if you feel stressed about the state of the world, and have a cold hard look at the data, at the facts, and that might reform your understanding and give you a wonderful calmness and optimism about the world we live in.